I observe the definitive collapse of diplomatic restraint as American imperial authority abandons institutional facades in favor of naked coercion delivered through rambling, hour-long displays of dominance before assembled global elites. Trump's performance at Davos represents far more than policy disagreement or alliance management. This marks the moment when American hegemony transitions from consensual leadership to imperial subjugation, executed through systematic humiliation of allies who discover their sovereignty exists only at Washington's discretion. The spectacle reveals the underlying architecture of contemporary American empire with unprecedented clarity. When the American president demands territorial concessions from Denmark while simultaneously mocking European civilization as unrecognizable, we witness imperial psychology in its purest form, the systematic dehumanization of subordinates disguised as alliance solidarity. The rambling nature of the discourse proves strategically calculated rather than spontaneous. Imperial authority requires no coherence, only submission from audiences who lack alternatives to American protection. This represents the culmination of systemic pressures that have been building since the pivot towards great power competition began reshaping global architecture. I analyze how Trump's Davos performance crystallizes the fundamental contradiction within Western alliance structures. Partnership rhetoric masking imperial hierarchy that becomes unsustainable when American interests diverge from allied preferences. The World Economic Forum, traditionally a platform for consensual elite coordination, transforms into a stage for imperial command performance where European leaders receive their instructions through public humiliation. The historical context proves crucial for understanding why this moment represents irreversible breakdown rather than temporary diplomatic friction. 7 decades of European integration within American-led institutions created dependencies that American leadership now exploits systematically to enforce compliance on issues entirely divorced from compliance. Collective security. NATO obligations designed to protect European sovereignty against external threats become instruments for undermining European sovereignty through internal pressure that no alliance framework can accommodate or constrain. European capitals find themselves trapped within institutional architecture they helped construct but cannot control when American interests require their subordination. The European Union lacks mechanisms for responding to systematic American humiliation delivered through alliance channels, exposing how continental integration enhanced rather than reduced vulnerability to imperial pressure. Brussels becomes a transmission mechanism for Washington's demands rather than a platform for European resistance to American overreach. The rambling discourse style itself carries strategic significance beyond personal psychology, demonstrating imperial authority through deliberate incoherence that subordinates must interpret as policy guidance regardless of logical structure or diplomatic convention. When Trump demands Greenland while simultaneously mocking European energy policies, attacking predecessor administrations and threatening Canada over insufficient gratitude, Allied governments must extract actionable intelligence from imperial stream of consciousness, rather than conventional diplomatic communication. This forces European elites into the position of supplicants attempting to divine meaning from imperial pronouncements, rather than partners engaged in strategic consultation between sovereign equals. The psychological warfare dimensions prove particularly sophisticated in their calculated humiliation of Allied leadership before assembled global elites. Trump's references to European civilization as unrecognizable while standing before European leaders at their premier international forum demonstrates imperial confidence that resistance capacity has been sufficiently degraded to permit public degradation without meaningful retaliation. Each personal attack creates domestic political costs for targeted leaders who must choose between defending national dignity and maintaining access to American protection that their security architecture requires for basic functionality. I examine how the Davos setting amplifies the humiliation through deliberate venue selection that maximizes elite witness to European subordination while transforming neutral coordination platforms into imperial command performances. The World Economic Forum traditionally provided neutral ground for alliance coordination through elite networking and institutional consultation that preserve diplomatic equality despite underlying power disparities. Trump's transformation of this platform into imperial theater demonstrates American confidence that European resistance capacity has been sufficiently degraded to permit public domination without meaningful retaliation risk or institutional constraint. The venue selection proves particularly calculated to demonstrate how thoroughly American empire has penetrated global elite coordination mechanisms that European integration was supposed to provide as alternatives to American dominance. When European leaders attend forums where they receive public instruction rather than participate in strategic consultation, they legitimize imperial hierarchy through their presence while destroying their domestic credibility for independent action against American pressure that increasingly operates through systematic humiliation rather than diplomatic disagreement. The personal attacks on individual European leaders prove strategically calculated to destroy diplomatic relationships that might constrain American policy autonomy while creating precedents for treating allied leaders as imperial subjects rather than sovereign equals. When Trump mocks Macron's sunglasses and threatens Carney directly over Canada's insufficient gratitude for American protection, he establishes patterns of interaction that reduce alliance consultation to imperial mood management rather than strategic coordination between autonomous partners with legitimate interests requiring accommodation. Each personal humiliation reduces that leader's domestic credibility for independent action against American pressure, creating political incentives for further submission to avoid additional public degradation that opposition parties can exploit. European leaders discover that resistance to American demands carries personal political costs that submission avoids, creating circular dependency where imperial pressure generates compliance through domestic political calculation rather than direct coercion that might generate nationalist backlash against American dominance. The economic warfare dimensions reveal how thoroughly American financial system control enables political coercion that transcends traditional alliance obligations. Trump's threats of escalating tariffs against European allies demonstrate confidence that dollar-based clearing systems provide sufficient leverage to extract territorial concessions from NATO members. European governments cannot respond effectively to American economic pressure without risking isolation from financial architecture that defines modern commercial relationships and governmental functionality. The timing proves strategically optimal for maximizing European vulnerability while minimizing resistance capacity. European military weakness, exposed catastrophically through Ukraine crisis ammunition shortages, eliminates credible deterrent options against American economic coercion. European energy dependency, complicated by Russian relationship breakdown, creates additional pressure points that American policy can exploit. European technological subordination to American platforms prevents autonomous response development without accepting isolation from systems that define contemporary governance and commerce. Chinese strategic observers recognize unprecedented opportunities for systemic advancement through Western alliance self-destruction that decades of Chinese diplomatic initiative could not have achieved independently. Every American humiliation of European allies reduces Washington's coalition-building capacity against Beijing's expansion across Eurasia and technological competition. European capitals increasingly alienated from American leadership through systematic degradation of partnership relationships become potential partners for Chinese alternative institutions that offer dignity rather than domination. Russian analysis proves equally optimistic about American imperial overreach accelerating European alienation from transatlantic relationships that no longer provide security benefits proportional to sovereignty costs. Trump's public demands for territorial concessions from European allies establish precedents that make Russian territorial arrangements appear reasonable by comparison. European governments may discover that accommodation with Moscow offers more predictable outcomes than continued subordination to Washington's increasingly erratic imperial demands. The broader implications extend far beyond immediate alliance management into the realm of civilizational transformation disguised as diplomatic discourse. Trump's Davos performance represents the moment when Western institutional cooperation definitively transforms into imperial hierarchy, enforced through systematic humiliation rather than consensual leadership based on shared interests. The fiction of Atlantic partnership dissolves before audiences, who witness European leaders receiving instructions rather than participating in strategic consultation. I analyze three potential trajectories emerging from this imperial assertion, each carrying profound implications for global order stability. First, European submission accompanied by accelerated dependency that cements continental vassalage while providing precedents for similar treatment of other regional powers. This pathway leads toward formal tributary relationships disguised as enhanced partnership agreements that reduce Allied sovereignty to ceremonial status under American oversight. Second, European attempts at strategic autonomy through deepened integration with non-Western powers, risking catastrophic American retaliation that could trigger systematic financial warfare against continental institutions. This pathway requires European unity that current institutional arrangements cannot generate, particularly given American intelligence penetration of European decision-making processes that enables preemptive disruption of autonomous initiatives before they achieve operational capability. Third, fragmentation of European cohesion as individual states pursue separate accommodations with American imperial authority, creating competitive submission that destroys collective bargaining capacity entirely. This pathway appears most probable given historical precedent and current institutional weaknesses, with smaller European states calculating that bilateral subordination offers better protection than collective resistance against American pressure, that alliance frameworks cannot constrain or mediate. Each trajectory leads toward the same fundamental outcome through different mechanisms: the end of European agency in global affairs as independent strategic actors. Whether through submission, isolation, or fragmentation, continental Europe loses capacity for autonomous action, becoming instead a managed periphery within an increasingly centralized American empire that no longer requires consensual legitimacy for policy implementation among nominal allies. The rambling discourse style itself becomes a tool of imperial psychology, forcing subordinates to extract meaning from incoherent pronouncements. While demonstrating that imperial authority requires no logical consistency or diplomatic courtesy, European leaders must respond to American demands delivered through stream of consciousness rather than conventional diplomatic channels, reducing alliance consultation to interpretation of imperial mood rather than strategic coordination between sovereign equals. Trump's repeated references to Biden demonstrate how American imperial authority transcends partisan political cycles, creating continuity of dominance regardless of administrative changes. The attacks on predecessor policies serve to establish personal imperial authority while maintaining systemic pressure on allies who discover that resistance to any American administration become resistance to American empire itself, regardless of ideological preferences or party affiliations. I conclude that this moment represents the definitive end of liberal international order as a framework for managing relationships between Western allies, marking the transition toward naked imperial hierarchy that requires no institutional legitimacy or consensual foundation. The Davos spectacle demonstrates American confidence that European dependency has reached levels sufficient to permit public humiliation without meaningful retaliation risk, establishing precedents for imperial behaviour that will reshape global alliance relationships permanently. The rambling imperial discourse becomes the new diplomatic normal, forcing allied governments to develop interpretive frameworks for extracting policy guidance from incoherent pronouncements rather than engaging in strategic consultation through institutional channels. This transforms alliance relationships into imperial subject management, where European sovereignty exists only within parameters defined by Washington's immediate requirements rather than long-term strategic coordination between autonomous partners. European capitals finally confront the reality that 7 decades of integration within American-led institutions created prosperity through the systematic surrender of strategic autonomy, generating dependencies that American leadership can exploit whenever Allied interests diverge from imperial requirements. The alliance system succeeds economically while failing politically, creating wealth without power that proves inadequate when confronted with determined imperial pressure, delivered through rambling displays of dominance that reduce diplomatic partnership to imperial entertainment.